Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you so much for being here and joining us for a conversation with two of the gentlemen. I just was on stage with Patrick Pouyanné in the other room from Total, and now we're going to move on to the kind of energy infrastructure side of this conversation, two companies that are really at the heart of global energy infrastructure. Let's just check in quickly on the Gulf, and Baker Hughes obviously had some work on the Ras Laffan plant that was damaged heavily, the LNG export facility. Can you tell us a little bit about how long you expect the repair work there might take? What do you what's in the cards for Ras Laffan moving forward? And, yeah.
So Tim, great to be here, and yes, Ras Laffan and Baker Hughes, first of all, provides liquefaction trains globally, and obviously within Ras Laffan, they've got a number of our trains and equipment. You've heard from the minister himself some of the impact that was to Train 4 and Train 6. At this stage, it's really threefold. The first is assessing what the damage is and seeing how quickly we can at least bring up production of the other trains, because at the moment everything is really firm and stood still. Then actually the repairs. What's been said and stated publicly is at the moment you've got damage on the coal boxes, and that could potentially take anywhere from 3 to 5 years. And then how do you sustain the production going forward? So we're actively monitoring the situation. We're working hand in hand with them. And I'd say that, again, everything that's out there is public to date. And as we go through it, we'll be able to assess more. I think what it does bring to light, though, is, again, the discussion around energy security and diversification. And so while we're going through this, they also have expansion plans. And maybe just to complement also Qatar Energy, they've not stopped with NFE, NFS, and NFW. And so, yes, the current trains, obviously, they need to fix and put back into production, but they still have very active plans to go up to 142 MPTA, and they're ongoing with the projects. And I was actually down in Qatar, Doha, meeting with the minister and also with Qatar LNG, and just committing our confidence and our team to be there as we go through also the new projects that are going to develop going forward.
And that work hasn't slowed down at all because of
No, it hasn't. And obviously the EPC contractors are there as well. And safety is a prime concern, and we put that always at the forefront. But also they're continuing to move forward. And as they look at it, these are long-term projects. We're looking at 20 years out. And we're also looking at the diversification across all of the LNG plays globally. And I think that's what we'll see now. This fear of an oversupply, which we viewed as overstated anyhow, is really not there. And you're going to see other FIDs happen here in the US as well as Argentina, other locations much faster.
So a lot of work for Baker Hughes ahead, definitely, at fulfilling all of that.
Yes, and we're obviously happy to partake in that and provide the liquefaction train.
Yeah. Bob, can you say a little bit, we've seen not just Ras Laffan, but just, if you look at Iran, Ukraine, there's so many examples recently where energy infrastructure has been targeted, kind of getting wrapped up in these conflicts. As a company that builds infrastructure, how do you sort of think about what it takes to build these facilities in a more hardy way, to think about defense, kind of protecting energy infrastructure as it becomes kind of more wrapped up into wars around the world?
Yep, Tim, also thanks for having me. It's great to be here. Before, I'd probably kind of separate the answer into two parts. Before speaking those two parts, just to continue on with what Lorenzo said, first and foremost, the safety and well-being of our people that are there. We have several thousand people there as well, has been first and foremost on our minds. And interestingly enough, on that, unfortunately, we learned a lot during the pandemic from an engineering standpoint of how to work from home and the services industry working from home. We probably underestimated the mental health effect that this time around has really affected, because not only is it working from home and all of those types of encumbrances, but also what's happening in and around people's homes in places like Dubai, in Abu Dhabi, in areas that may not be familiar with those types of circumstances. Mm-hmm. On the kind of the resilience, I'd say there's two main parts. One is that thinking about the infrastructure needs from from society outward, right? And so, and a little bit of experience of this was when I was in the service as well, is when we would go in and rebuild either war-ravaged or even conflict-ravaged areas of the world, or natural disasters, we would think about it from the perspective of what does the human need in order to go back to some form of life. So things like electricity, clean water, transportation network, starting from that and working outward.
Right.
So that's kind of the approach.
This was your work with the Seabees.
With the Seabees in the Navy. Today, moving forward, it's those threats that we probably didn't think about as much as we did back 20, 30 years ago around redundancy and resiliency, as well as cyber protection as well. And that just doesn't apply to the Middle East, that applies to facilities all over the world today. So a little bit of a different, still starting with the human first, but now thinking about all of those unanticipated ramifications
and
conflicts.
maybe having a sort of premium on redundancy, or maybe that changes in some way the way you think about capital allocation. You need to kind of have a little bit more than maybe you would have thought you needed in the past.
Absolutely, especially in water infrastructure.
Really?
That concept of redundancy.
What's different about water infrastructure there?
Clean drinking water facilities, water treatment facilities, if they're unfortunately hit, you could wipe out societies,
right?
As we know it.
That seems like maybe a little bit of a blind spot that we need to be more cognizant of. Would you
Very
say?
much so, also because of contamination reasons too. So
okay.
those things are being just not in the Middle East, or that's across the world.
Lorenzo, can you expand a little bit on the, you were speaking about Qatar Energy's plans for LNG expansion. When you look at the global LNG picture, I mean, one thing we've seen from this current conflict is the risk that stems from having this choke point in the Strait of Hormuz. Do you think that the conflict kind of strengthens the case for more LNG investment, or does it actually sort of weaken it in the sense of we have these few choke points and maybe there's an increased vulnerability there? How do you view that kind of risk calculation?
I think it actually strengthens very much the adage of energy diversification and also energy expansion. And if you look at globally, the resource that we are plentiful of in multiple locations, including here in the US, is natural gas. And if you think about the future, natural gas isn't just a transition fuel, it's a destination fuel. It can be affordable, sustainable, and secure. And what you're going to see happen is continued development of LNG as being the way in which to transport that natural gas. In addition, as you think about what's happened with the Straits of Hormuz, it's going to bring back to the reality that you need infrastructure and redundancy, as Bob just mentioned. And it's situations like this that remind you, we had draft plans for a pipeline network across the Middle East. We've had pipelines built in the past and left redundant. And if you think about also globally, there's the opportunity of pipeline networks. You think of Argentina. Argentina has huge natural gas resources, associated gas. And from the Vaca Muerta down, now they're looking at LNG expansion. You look at the pipeline opportunities here in the US, which are now starting to come to the forefront, and the opportunity for the Permian gas, both associated and also all of the gas in the Marcellus and taking it to the East Coast. So we need to build that redundant infrastructure, because you need to make sure that we don't have these choke points be the burden of energy supply. And we're in an energy demand decade. And one of the things that I think is going to come to the forefront is people are going to be willing to look at that as being not a financial return, but as a necessity, so that they can make sure that supply of energy is there on a continuous basis. And not just natural gas, but also energy expansion across the aspects of increased renewables, increased lessened dependency on any single choke points of single locations, and diversity of the energy supply, including geothermal, including nuclear. So we actually think it's a good lesson to remind us that we need to think beyond the current and look to the expansion and also the redundancies in place.
Do you think the capital is there for those projects? I mean, if there's a sense of kind of redundancy to some of them, does that lessen the bankability of them, or is Wall Street behind this mission?
I think actually at the end of the day, the financial markets will work themselves out. And if you look at the oscillation that happens in pricing when these impacts occur, there are some people that are making a lot of money right now because they can sell on spot, and you're going to see that come through also by having more affordable and sustainable. And I think that's what will actually come into the forefront, because one thing that at least we believe is the demand for energy is unsustainable. It continues to grow. It just is a human nature that we like to consume energy. And if you look at generative AI, you look at the data centers that Bob is building, not just in the developed world, but in the developing world, we have a decade of energy demand. We've got to make it affordable, sustainable, and secure. And that's going to need also a robust infrastructure across multiple locations that we've potentially ignored in the past. And I look at Algeria, plentiful of gas. I look at Argentina. You look at the US, there's a lot that can be done to sustain that affordability and security.
Bob, even looking beyond energy, you think you were saying backstage that the Middle East is actually the fastest growing region for your business. Does that change now? Do you still see, do you see a kind of change in the ability of those countries to continue investing in the type of infrastructure that you build? How is that going to change your plans?
I think it's early. I think it's probably too early to speculate on what happens. We'll say this, there is ambitious plans around Saudi's Vision 2030, all that's going on in the Emirates right now. Does that get elongated a bit? Possibly, but it's also a society that has great ambition to be an integrated part of the world. And so I wouldn't count them out.
Wouldn't count them out. Yeah.
Tim, could I go back to something Lorenzo was saying?
Please do.
Regards to,
yes.
He was talking about it. It was a great kind of analogy. He was talking about it in the context of LNG and kind of even the hydrocarbon space even broadly. It's interesting. The same applies in non-human driven catastrophes that are having an effect on elements of the world that we need as humans. And the one that came to mind was water.
Yeah.
Right? If you look at the effects right now of climate and what's happening where it's kind of two extremes, that there's either water scarcity issues or too much water, and we have flooding issues all over. Things like major metropolitan, caused by climate, major and aged infrastructure, major metropolitan areas in the US that in certain cases were 2 to 3 days away from clean drinking water as a result of fires and other natural disasters that have occurred. So that same kind of concept of what do we do around potable reuse and reclaim? How do we now take investment? And I love what you said, Lorenzo, about the financial markets. We'll figure it out, and invest that in elements that we, our children, our grandchildren are going to need for generations.
Right. Yeah. Let's expand a little bit, Bob, on your data center work, and you guys are doing a lot there. Baker Hughes also. What was this number? You doubled your data center order forecast to $3 billion earlier this year, if I'm getting that right.
Yeah, I'm going to get an order from Bob. Hopefully.
Yeah. So both companies doing a lot in this space. What do you think the energy industry is getting wrong at the moment, Bob, about what hyperscalers actually need? What do we need to do differently there?
Yeah. First of all, I don't know if the energy industry is doing anything wrong. So maybe another way of characterizing it is, I think there is, and we'll go to the hyperscalers, but also it's getting broader, right? There's now the neo-cloud providers, and there are now providers of compute space that compute loads that are increasing at a very, very rapid pace. Everyone's focused in on the energy requirements. There's an ecosystem of a supply network that brings these to bear. Of those, the electrical OEM space, I think the full consideration of if you put that much of a load on the entirety of the supply chain, there are going to be some choke points in those areas. And so looking at it holistically as a full, kind of a full multifaceted solution that takes a village to build. I think a little bit more attention on that, because now we're building, and then you kind of add on maybe some geopolitical uncertainty around that, and then you've got kind of like the ultimate state of entropy happening all at once. And so all of those things, and now I'm now going to applaud the supply chain, is that I think looking at it holistically now and saying, okay, how do we do this in a more programmatic way instead of just going to West Texas and saying, okay, there's ubiquitous power here, that's where we're going to go. Well, now what's going on inside the data center is increasing. It's increasing the water needs. It's increasing the cooling needs. It's also increasing the complexity in the high bandwidth memory chips that are feeding it as well. So we're kind of looking at it holistically there from all perspectives.
Lorenzo, can you, from your point of view, you're looking at this kind of very rapidly growing order book related to data centers and AI. How do you scale up, your manufacturing? What kind of conversations are you having with, your suppliers upstream of you about how to prepare and respond to that kind of demand growth?
So I think you have to take a step back and say, where do we need to be in 10 years' time? And from a capacity perspective, really look at the end marketplace. And the end marketplace for us is power generation. And when you think about power generation off the grid, it's a theme that is going to be growing because the grid at this stage is unable to sustain the demand. And so distributed power generation is going to be key from a data center perspective, but then also from an industrial perspective, from an off-grid of large urban areas. And you're seeing this whole aspect of interconnectivity with different stakeholders, but reliant on oneself. And so a cluster of capabilities, and where we're looking to is what are the equipment and services we need to provide over the course of those 10 years to each of those end markets, not be dependent on any one, but classify it from a power generation perspective, and then work with the stakeholders and the ecosystem entirely. And we've doubled our production capacity relative to industrial gas turbines, not just because of data centers, but because we see pipelines and compression stations being necessary. We see industrial backup power being necessary, and that's the way we look at it. And I think you do have to take a step back and look at it more holistically. If you just go to any one end thing, you're bound to be wrong, because that end thing is going to move around, and it's a flavor of the month one day, and then it goes out of flavor.
It's a moving target.
Moving target. So you've got to pick the thematic aspects, and that's what we're trying to do within Baker Hughes from a technology, equipment, and service perspective.
Which for this type of equipment that we're talking about just seems like more is that's the mandate.
It really goes back to a fundamental theme that we're in an energy demand and an infrastructure build, and it's also natural if you think about it. It's been nearly 60 years since we really did anything to the infrastructure of the grid in the United States. And we've been looking at no real increase being required. Now you look at developing nations that still have to produce it. So I think it's a generational aspect that comes, and this is the opportunity during the next decade.
And there's not a risk of overcapacity or having you don't see any kind of stranded asset risk or anything.
Look, there'll be some. At the end of the day, the markets will solve that. We pick the areas that we think are the winning areas over time. And again, it's the importance of having the right attributes. There will be, today there's some non-financially suitable solutions being given to data centers. I mean, if you have 200 1 megawatts or stuff, there's solutions that are available. Are they potentially the best reliable and sustainable for the future? I don't know. That's a question that has to be proven.
Can I comment just on one item on that? Because I do think this concept of overcapacity gets talked about a lot, especially when you look at some of the capital programs that the hyperscalers and others are putting out there. I think the difference today, and we're seeing this in the biotechnology industry as well, is it's almost like this virtuous cycle. Because AI is driving innovation at such a rapid pace, that's then driving the need for the infrastructure to support it, Same thing is going on in the biotech world as well. It's okay if the world were to be static. Back in the old days, chips had a certain need, and then that need was very much tied to consumer demand. Same thing with drugs. That's all changed now.
Right.
And so now that you've got this acceleration and velocity in innovation, it's hard to see an overcapacity.
Bob, in the 5 seconds we have left, you're meeting with some U.S. officials and members of Congress this week. What's your biggest, most important message for how to get U.S. infrastructure back on track?
Consistency in funding and clarity in approach.
Wonderful. Bob, Lorenzo, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
All right, thank you.